Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Tortoise Cybersecurity Summit. This session is all about the victims. So we've looked at the perpetrators, the countries, the technologies, and now we're going to talk about the industries and the people who are most vulnerable to attack, and then how we can best protect them, and what some of the latest hacks and attacks can tell us about how the threat landscape is changing and how to therefore best guard against it. That is all the introduction I'm going to give, apart from to say also we're going to talk about skills later, which is really, really important as well. But we've only got 40 minutes to do it, so I'm just going to quickly introduce all the guests and then we'll get right into it. To my left, we've got two bearded men called Dave. Dave Atkinson is founder of SenseOn, which uses AI tools to protect companies from cyber attacks, and also has quite an interesting background in the government and in the military. Dave Harvey is head of cybersecurity at FTI Consulting and worked on the delivery around the NHS Nightingale hospitals, which sounds really fascinating and important. And then John Tibble, who works in the government section of Capita, liaising with big government departments over cyber security, so he can give us a great perspective from that angle. And last but not least, on the screen is Rashmy Chatterjee. She's the chief executive of ISTARI, the global cyber security platform, and she's thought a lot about these areas. So I think, Rashmy, if it's okay with you, I'll start with you. I mean, ISTARI is kind of has a kind of bird's eye view of the cybersecurity ecosystem. Is there a set of characteristics that makes a particular industry or a particular business more susceptible to cyber attacks?
Yeah. So hi, Alexi. Nice to see you again. And I'm sorry I'm not with everyone. Looks wonderful. I think the rule is simple with any adversary, right? Follow the purpose, follow the money, or follow the purpose. So the industries then shine out themselves. You know, the first one probably are industries that provide low-hanging fruit, who haven't invested enough in building a cybersecurity. Finance, for example, has most large banks have very large cybersecurity divisions. So any industry that has low-hanging fruit, retail is definitely one. The second to think about is industries that are very reliant on their supply chain, because the bigger your supply chain, the bigger your footprint and the easier it is to find access. And we've seen a lot of that activity in the manufacturing segment, manufacturing distribution. And the third is a lot of attackers today are state-sponsored, state-funded. So if they have ill intent towards anybody outside of the geopolitical ecosystem, it would be critical infrastructure. So I'd say critical infrastructure, anyone who is low-hanging fruit but has a lot to lose from a reputational or downtime loss, and any organization which is very dependent on a supply chain.
That's a really good way of setting out the framework of what we're going to discuss, I think. But just on critical infrastructure, what struck me earlier in the day were the comments, I think by Tom Hurd and perhaps others, that the criminal cyber security kind of tranche, as in not the state actors, the criminals, were increasingly turning to critical infrastructure, targeting critical infrastructure. Critical infrastructure is already being targeted by nation states. So is critical infrastructure a particular pinch point, do you think, going forward, a particular industry that maybe in the future will become even more vulnerable than it is now?
Yeah. It is, I mean, if you had a geopolitical adversary, where would you invest to attack? And Tom and I have spoken about this in the past. So yes, it's going to become more critical. It's also a very effective way of putting progress or slowing down progress of an adversary. quite not that difficult to do. And critical infrastructure, again, because the investment in the past hasn't been that high, there's a lot of vulnerabilities there. They're moving very quickly, expanding to IT. Often the operation side of organizations and the IT side of the organizations have not connected so well. So again, it's weak, it's effective, and it's very political.
You talk a lot, Rashmy, about something called cyber resilience, which is different, as I understand it, from cyber protection. What is cyber resilience, and how do you implement it if you're a company?
Yeah, we do. At ISTARI, we believe that it's not about cybersecurity alone. Companies are going to become more digital, to get top line growth, to get efficiencies, etc. So you always have to think of, as you're building that infrastructure of a digital business, how deep is your foundation? If you're building a city, how deep is that foundation? So it isn't just about securing, it is being able to withstand continual evolution of threat. I know you had Joe on a panel some time back, but we always talk about three sort of modes of operation. The first is steady state. You want to make sure you're protected, your exposures are covered, etc. The second is continual evolution. Are you always assessing for new risks? Are you always assessing for new threats? Is your operating model set up for success? And the third is crisis. So when we talk about cyber resilience, it's much more foundational and long-term versus this idea of only protection. It's being able to withstand what may come in the future as you become more digital.
I think that's really interesting because it picks up directly on what Niamh, I think, was saying in the last session about guarding for the present and for the future. And Dave, if you just pick up on that point in terms of the sort of victims that your company SenseOn is seeing, who are the kind of primary victims today? And do you think that they will be the same primary victims in 5 years' time, in a couple of years' time even?
Yes, it's a good question. And our view and what we see is anyone has got the potential to be a victim with an internet connection, which is an unhelpful answer, but maybe with and supported by some helpful context will make more sense. So I think it was Willie Sutton that said, when asked, he was a very famous American bank robber, why do you rob banks? Well, that's where the money is. And that held true for financially motivated actors, really, 90s Russian business network, all the way through state actors targeting Bangladeshi banks and things like that. But then what we had in the late 2000s was the advent of blockchain technologies, which for the first time, as they developed, allowed criminals to be paid en masse by anyone. So you didn't have to directly attack the instruments of the financial services sector to literally transfer money. You could get money from a much wider range of victims. So monetization is the first reason why I say anyone's a potential victim.
Crypto in particular, or block?
As in Bitcoin and the ability to get paid, yeah. So you can get money from anyone basically in a pretty non-attributable fashion. And then the second trend that I think is also playing into this is the organization and the reorganization of the cybercrime groups themselves. So I'm sure it's already been talked about today. This sort of affiliate model that the cybercrime organizations has come up with, this ransomware as a service, which means that you don't have to possess the technical skills to be able to conduct the hacking yourself. You can be provided with the functionality and the infrastructure to do it. And the reason why most people have run the risk of being a victim is the motivation of these affiliates is they predominantly come from very poor families and backgrounds, and this is a genuine way for them to make money. And so they don't care, they're not unmotivated and focused. See, actor, they're not that organized. They're there to make money, and so therefore the target addressable market of victims is so much wider.
I mentioned in one of the previous sessions that I tried to see how these ransomware groups were advertising themselves on the dark web. It's kind of easy to find, and they had a list of companies that hadn't paid, so they put up all their information, and you know, they were the opposite of the JP Morgans of this world. They were your random, like, Midwest manufacturing company, like, not a tiny company, 100 employees maybe, but you would never have heard of them. And if those are the sort of prototypical victims of a ransomware group, how do you protect them?
Yeah, it is very difficult, right? And it's only, you know, if you look at like a cybersecurity maturity model, right? You know, you go to if you're there just purely to make money, you go to the path of least resistance. And so these lower maturity organizations that haven't, you know, quite, you know, been able to garner a cybersecurity budget, or, as Dimitri said, be able to recruit someone to advise them on how to best proceed, then, you know, these are going to be the easiest targets, you know. And so, you know, it's getting on with doing the basics well, and getting them the basic cyber hygiene sorted, of course, is a first step. But yeah, that is definitely the soft underbelly and the easiest targets for these affiliates of the ransomware gangs to go.
Dave Harvey, you've got quite a lot of experience at FTI dealing with the bigger companies at a board level. In terms of the big companies and the big corporates who find themselves subject to cyber attack, describe a kind of prototypical victim. Is it more a kind of sectoral exposure, or is it actually this company just hasn't got the systems in place to guard against an attack?
To take a normal consultancy approach, I'll say it depends. Often we see attacks can follow the news. It follows the money, as Rashmy said earlier. So we see at the moment a lot of interest in areas like alternative energy. Financial sector's always got a lot of energy for obvious reasons. Other areas, technology and communications. You know, last couple of years, we've seen this huge change. As we're seeing today, we've got this hybrid environment that's working really nicely. So this hybrid thing's emerging. It's an opportunity for businesses, and attackers are exploiting that. How they're exploiting it, sometimes they're looking at the companies. Nearly all the time, they're looking at people. And so one of the themes for me is it needs to be more than just technology. It's about people. How do we educate people? How do we protect them? Because for us, they are absolutely our first line of defense. And then we look at process and technology, and the three of those together is a true capability. Other things, though, that have been mentioned about supply chain attacks, that understanding of third parties, and the third-party risk that we've seen this year with a number of attacks that have really crippled a lot of US economy. Sometimes that isn't targeted at a particular sector, it's an indirect attack. You've been targeted because you use a particular piece of technology. That's a really interesting change, and maybe something a few years ago we would have expected only at the state level. Actually, what I would suggest we're seeing is more important for business at the moment is not necessarily the state level, it's that organized crime element that is making an absolute packet in ransomware, but more frequently, business email compromise, payment redirection, stuff that doesn't make the news, but is happening so often.
And you've also, I think, been quite heavily involved in investigating kind of big cyber breaches. Can you give me an example of a couple of, maybe without naming names if you don't want to, but talk to me about how those breaches came about, and ultimately, you know, is this down to typically, you know, someone picking up a USB stick in a parking lot and then plugging it into their computer, or how does a vulnerability occur?
Yeah, it's a really good area to look at, because if you just think in cybersecurity or technology terms, I think you've missed the boat. When you think about social engineering as one of the first ways to create that attack path, all of a sudden you're opening up a really rich context. And that's what the exploiters, the threat actors are doing, and therefore we must be thinking in the same way. So whenever we often get brought on board post-incident, and we talk a lot to boards about the multiple costs of a cyber breach. The first one's very obvious about that incident response, being able to come in and sort out your system, as we talked about earlier, get the threat actor out, clean your system up and remediate. But the next stage you look at is things like regulatory fines. Possibly down the line, you're also looking at litigation costs. And whenever you're looking at those, that's what we tend to get brought in by law firms where you're conducting maybe a root cause analysis. Why did this happen? And the important question that is always asked is, did the organization take the appropriate level of protection around their data in terms of the technology and the organizational measures? So really, again, you're not focused on tech. You're looking at technology, you're looking at people, you're looking at process together.
It's possibly a question for all of you or anyone in the room that wants to chime in, but I was struck by Greg's comments in the previous session that we shouldn't call the failure of a company to report a cyber attack a cover-up because they took legal action in the interest of their shareholders not to disclose it. There is obviously an argument, potentially at least, that it is a cover-up because by failing to disclose it, you're preventing kind of collective action from being taken. I just wonder, I mean, you having investigated a lot of these attacks, do you think that some sort of mandatory reporting requirement would protect victims?
It's a really difficult question because, you know, when we look at, especially around attacks, it seems obvious that you don't want to pay ransomware. It seems absolutely obvious. Why would you want to fund organized crime? But if you're an organization like critical infrastructure, a hospital, a national grid, and you've no options because you don't have any backups because you didn't do that, you're out of action, your entire thing's encrypted, and you've expended all of your options. It might be catastrophic for the business to admit and to be public. Yeah. And therefore, it's not a simple case of, for every data breach, you must be open with the public. There's times, as we're seeing with a lot of companies, they are paying ransomware. They are paying the amount. And that's a really complex question. There's no easy answer there because, especially at the SME level, are you going to tell the CEO of or the owner who's crafted this company from day one that they must report this and it will be catastrophic for your business, but it'll be better for everybody.
Even if the disclosure is not public, if it's just to a central database.
And that's where you get into some more interesting, how could I help warn off other businesses? How could I, for the greater good, pass on things like indicators of compromise? And there's, as we see with the financial sector, how we can enable those sorts of, not necessarily mandates, but facilitate that information sharing.
John, you work very closely with big government departments on cybersecurity. Does that mean that the sort of threats that you're helping them guard against come primarily from nation states?
No, I think there's a whole range of areas of threat here. And interestingly, in terms of the kinds of threads we've got here, if we're to protect victims across a whole host of spaces, the risk of paraphrasing a previous Prime Minister, I think the answer is education, education, education. Now, we've touched on, I mean, Rashmy was talking about resilience, and I think that's critically important. We're not just talking about continuity from small teams who are very specialist. We have to grow the pool of expertise. Now, that comes through sharing lessons. I think Dave too has just talked about some of the challenges of talking about things that have failed. Now, we've all learned, I think we've all been involved in huge programs that have gone horrendously wrong, and we all learn lessons from those mistakes. Now, we do need to find a way of sharing that for the common good, for adding social value. But again, that's about education. And I think if we've had the challenges of digital transformation over the last decade, then it was hard enough pre-pandemic. We've then moved into an era where people are working from home, where, you know, if historically, I mean, I think the previous speaker talked about the challenge of CISOs setting up firewalls and then not knowing how they're configured. Well, if you've got that for a corporate body that is very focused on being in the center, and then suddenly it's got its distributed workforce, education is going to be the way in which we tackle that. I think the third part of this is, frankly, whether you look at big corporations or big government departments, they're not going to have a lot of money. We're going to have to be very focused with where we put our cash. Now, again, huge, big programs, whichever sector you're in, have got a great track record of not delivering. So we've got to be very careful where we put that. And education, I think, can actually help us enormously. We can raise the level of cyber education across workforces out in the sort of citizen workplace, as it were. We can all do our bit. It's as simple on occasion as just not using really stupid passwords. I mean, someone who thinks, oh, I've changed my password from PASSWORD to PA55W0RD. Right, that's pretty obvious as well. So, I mean, there are things where people think, oh, I'm being smart. No, that's old hat. We've got to help people think through all of the challenges.
I mean, if you wrote down on a sort of single sheet of A4 paper all of the kind of like cybersecurity 101, like you must not have password as password, and there were 20 of them, and everybody in a government department did those, how much of the problem would be solved? 80%?
I wouldn't pick on a government department. I would look at users across industry.
Okay, go on.
Yeah, I mean, that would solve some of it. It's other things as well. It's where you store information. It's what you don't do in terms of where you do your backups. It's even things like, have you done your patches? I think, again, Rashmy talked about the challenges of regulated industries not having invested. And if you've got that, particularly in an environment where there are price caps and there's, if we've got a grudge purchase, like we don't want to pay a lot for our electricity or our gas or anything else, that has an impact on where those corporations try and invest their money to get their return. Now, we've all got to accept that there's going to be some trade-offs. That might be regulation. There's actually also got to be an understanding collectively that you don't get, you get what you pay for. If you're going for something cheap, quite often you will get some corners cut and you won't get the best quality sort of thinking and investment, or it might be delayed because we can't afford it this month or this quarter.
And is there, I mean, in your experience with working with government, is there a department that stands out as being particularly vulnerable? And the reason I ask that question is because it seems like a department like Defence, for instance, would have a lot of attacks coming into it, but because it kind of knows what it's got, it presumably has greater defences in a cyber sense than, say, the Department of Education, whereas another department would have fewer defences, but also there'd be fewer attacks. Is that right?
Well, I wouldn't want to comment on client vulnerabilities. If you're looking across government departments, I think there are some outstanding departments. I mean, you look at, we've had Kieran Martin in earlier, and obviously the National Cybersecurity Centre has been set up relatively recently and is it's a global player. It's a leading thinker in what can be done, and they're very good also at working out how to better protect all of those other government departments that they work alongside. I think part of the challenge for government departments will be, again, austerity. There will be pressures on budgets, turnover of staff, people moving on. I mean, there is a challenge around knowledge transfer. How do you keep knowledge within departments? Because it's extremely valuable. If there's turnover of staff every 18 months, how do you retain that corporate knowledge and that corporate memory? So it's a challenge for us.
Tom, do you want to say something?
Just one comment and one question. Picking up on the point of education, it's very interesting to see a new emerging area of academia, which is called cyber psychology, which I hope will help us understand why we keep falling for it. Why do we not change our passwords? Why do we fall for online fraud? Why do we fall for misinformation? So I think it's a useful academic exercise to build up more knowledge around human behaviours in this space and not just talk about the technology. My question was actually around resilience and exercising. So in my experience, exercising is the full reality check on the plan, and usually the plan lasts about 2 minutes into the exercise. But it'd be very interesting to hear from the panel what kind of exercising is being done at a corporate level, because actually it's useful for all of us to think, what would we do if we woke up one morning and our computer was stuck? Who would we tell? What would we do? You know, all these kind of things. So it'd be useful to hear from your experiences on exercising.
And just define exercising.
Well, this is like, what do you do when there's an attack? So companies, certainly government departments, would exercise a lot, you know, what they would do in a certain crisis scenario. And that brings up enormous amounts of lessons learned, you know, about kind of roles and responsibilities, what works and what doesn't. I just don't know how much it's used in the private sector, and in the work that you guys do with companies to build their resilience.
Maybe we could come to Dave on that.
I think one of the biggest lessons that we've seen from incident responses is difficult. And the last thing we want to do is to try it out for the first time in real. It's difficult, therefore you must practice it. And one of the best simulations at the board level is walking through that, because for the first time we really see boards understand that this is not the CIO and the CISO's job anymore. This is actually an organizational challenge. So whenever an incident happens, who do they speak to? Who do they go for legal advice? Who do they go for communications advice, incident response from a cybersecurity perspective, forensic analysis, all those things. But who do they speak to internally? How do they let their employees know what on earth is going to happen? From the board level, what are the questions they need to be asking? And often we see, as we talked about today, about, you know, CISO's just implemented a new firewall. That's really tactical data. What is the board level question that they should be asking in terms of their risk exposure, their reputational exposure, their legal and financial exposure? They're all really tough challenges. So we see an awful lot of that, and increasingly for the boards, as they see these issues play out in the media, as they see the attacks in the US and on the East Coast, they were really interested in how does that affect them? What would they do during that scenario? If it's critical infrastructure, who are the government agencies that they need to liaise with? What are the options open to them? So it's a really critical matter. And like I said, if you take something away, incident response is hard. So please practice it.
Let's bring in Rashmy on that point, if we could. Rashmy, Tom made a point about exercising, and you obviously talk a lot about cyber resilience. With the firms that you work with, do you have exercises where you say, okay, let's pretend for 2 days that your internet's down?
Yeah, actually exercising, I would say, is everything. That's, you know, a big part of being resilient is being prepared. And when you're attacked, what we have found is most critical is speed of response. And what slows down speed is confusion. Confusion on who owns what, what's the chain of command. You know, what is your philosophy? If you're a government-owned organization, you might actually prefer having a longer downtime versus giving in to an attacker or a demand for ransom. If you are a commercial enterprise, you might choose to behave differently. And so we run a lot of board tabletop exercises. And what I find fascinating is that there is a real lot of work to be done in aligning the board. Get your communications, your government relations, your chief revenue officer, your chief legal of your general counsel, your CIO, CTO together, and everyone looks at it from a different angle. And until you have rehearsed that hundreds of times, you are going to slow down your speed of response because you're going to look for confirmation of your action, and that gives the attacker more time. And now you put this in context of a really swiftly moving infrastructure, right? We are all moving so quickly to this digital world, obviously driven very much by work from home and an expanded threat surface. And one of the things we encourage organizations, I mean, the board tabletop exercise is one which is really good to understand. Is the board aligned on the philosophy of how do you handle a demand for ransom? And the second one is when you're moving and changing fast, test all the time to make sure you're discovering what could have got exposed because you're changing so fast. You know, you're moving your infrastructure, moving applications, data, increasing your perimeter to a lot of new identities that are digital. Keep testing all the time to make sure that you are, better safe than sorry.
Thank you, Rashmy. So testing is a really important part of protecting the victims that we've been talking about. Let's talk a bit about, let's pick up on John's point about education, and also let's bring in the debate about skills. So could you just tell us, Rashmy, firstly, how, if you were talking to a business and they said, I want to educate my workforce in general about how to avoid an attack, what would you say to them? And secondly, just pick up, if you would, the point about skills. What kind of skills are we missing in the cybersecurity space that we need to fill?
Yeah, so lots of questions there. But first of all, if you just go out of the skills, and it's a strategy, right? Cybersecurity, cyber resilience, that area is going to require talent, and you need a strategic approach. We have recently spoken to a CEO, for example, who is really thinking about what does he want his organization to look like? What kind of people, where should they be located? What kind of empowerment? So I think firstly, you need a talent strategy. I guess well-known fact is the average tenure of a CISO is 26 months. Every time you have a change in CISO, you have a 20% change in personnel. Big exposure. I think somebody talked about if you're leaving the people out of the equation, that's a huge loss. From us, when in my last role, I was at IBM, and we talked a lot to universities because the demand for cybersecurity professionals far outweighs the supply. And I think one of the challenges we have is that we don't create a funnel. And when we create a funnel, we think very simplistically. We tend to think it's got to be STEM professionals. We worked with a couple of universities and found the funnel comes beautifully with, ex-Ministry of Defense personnel, law enforcement personnel, psychologists, forensics, detectives. It's the skill that we have to look for versus a particular qualification. It's the training of being vigilant, of being, of really, again, it's outpacing your attacker, outthinking your attacker, thinking one step ahead. It has less to do with qualification. The implementation, of course, needs a particular qualified sort of education. But the ability to be really strong and resilient, build that funnel, you have to expand it to a lot more outside of just STEM.
Hey, Atkinson, let me pick up on the skills point. One thing that stuck in my mind from what Eugene Kaspersky said was that maybe we'll get to a point where there's going to be some critical infrastructure that's unhackable, that we're just going to get to this stage where we've won, basically. We've got the technology that will protect from anything. Do you think that as technology gets better and presumably more user-friendly, and we work towards that goal, that the skills that we so desperately need now actually will become less important? You sell technology and then that's it?
Yes, it's an interesting point. I think, obviously a lot of our work has been around, trying to take workload off a very scarce resource. So people say there's sort of 3 to 4 million empty cybersecurity jobs out there at the minute. So whilst technology will always be getting, more secure, the long tail of legacy technology that is still vulnerable, as well as just how we produce, adopt, and consume technology as society, individuals, and organizations will be presenting more and more risk. So there's this sort of like dichotomy between, as time goes on, it gets more secure, but then there's so much more of it to hack. So it's a challenge.
Right, I see. Yeah, the legacy software point is really, really important. Dave, Harvey, can you can you unpack for us a bit in terms of the education and skills question? Obviously, you've got a small group of people working within an organization that are specifically charged with protecting the company, but then there's a much wider question about how your general employees are trained and educated. Can you just talk about, in terms of your interactions with big businesses, how both of those questions kind of interact with each other, and which, if any, are more important, or are they both equally important?
Yeah, I think as we've seen recently, innovation's key. We've seen this huge digital transformation, and therefore innovation is seen as a competitive advantage. Within that, we see diversity as being a cornerstone of that innovation. Having people from really different backgrounds who think in a really different way. Whenever we do investigations, the team that we've recruited, some of the best skill sets come from the humanities. They're not technical backgrounds. They're people who can take technical skills that we can give them, and they can learn them, because our technology is changing so quickly, we have to continue to learn. But they're able to translate it into language that a board understands and that users understand, and it means something to them. So when you look at a company and you look at the users within a company, rather than sit them down once a year to go through a 30-minute or a 60-minute PowerPoint that they absolutely detest, is making it absolutely real to them. It's absolutely concentrating on that human element to security, because for us, that is your first line of defense, but it's absolutely key to resilience.
Thank you. This gentleman here has a question he's been waiting very patiently to ask it, or indeed to make a point.
It's a bit of both. So this session was all about...
Could you just introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry, yes. So my name's Duncan Jones. I'm from Cambridge Quantum. And the topic of this session was something along the lines of who are the victims of the cybercrime. And I noticed that we spent the majority of time speaking about the companies who get hacked, resulting in the victims, which are presumably you and I, whose data is now for sale in the black market. And as a consumer, I feel without many tools at my own disposal to protect my data against all that threat. I mean, there's privacy regulations and things that should imply that companies who process it act in a certain way. But I don't know whether that was just a thread of conversation we could pick at, because I feel like the end consumer is particularly undefended, and yet they are the victim in all of this.
Thank you. That's really interesting. John, maybe I can give you the last word, because people are signalling to me that it's time to close down the session, even though it says on the briefing document that it's 3:25, and therefore we've got another 3 minutes left. But anyway, John, I wonder, could you either pick up on the point that was just made about consumers? Are we looking in the wrong place in terms of who are the victims here? And more generally, in your work with government, are you optimistic about the trajectory that we're on, or are things like austerity really worrying you about where we're going in terms of protection?
I think the point about the consumer is critical, because it's very easy to see cybercrime and hostile foreign states as being targeted at big corporations where all the money is, or the state, and it being anonymous. But actually, it is the individual who can't get a hospital appointment because the system's hacked, or it's the individual who can't go on holiday because the flight system's down. Those are all consumers who are affected. And we do have to make sure that the discussion is about the impact on citizens and the environment that everyone lives and works in, and not just on the big organisations that feed and run in that environment. So I think it's a very important point.
Thank you very much. Well, I mean, we could continue this discussion for a long time to come, but we've got 5 minutes now before James Harding has a fireside chat with Jen Easterly, the US Director for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which will be brilliant, and it's happening in 5 minutes. So until then, thank you very much to all our guests.